Imagine a world where the tragic events of September 11, 2001 never happened. How different would things be today? What if those terrible plans had been stopped and the Twin Towers still stood tall in the New York skyline? Let's think about how our lives might have changed. Back then, only a small number of Americans thought their country should be the strongest in the world. Surprisingly, that hasn't changed much. Even now, only a few people think America should be the only superpower. Before 9/11, more Americans wanted the government to spend money on defense. But now, fewer people feel that way. It's like the desire for more security has gone down. Even though America has been involved in big changes in other countries since then, like in the Middle East, many Americans don't feel as powerful as they used to. Some even think America isn't as important in the world as it used to be. Why is this happening? Maybe it's because being powerful and making big decisions in the world is harder than people thought. Or maybe it's because the tough times, like the financial crisis, have made people less confident. Another idea is that maybe 9/11 didn't affect how Americans see the world as much as we thought it would. Let us begin with a scenario that feels as a grim reality to many Americans who take pain in how the country is progressing. If the September 11, 2001 attacks never happened, Americans would be marking some later date as the anniversary of the most devastating terrorist strike on the homeland in modern history. The high watermark of terrorist attacks against Americans remains the late 1980s. Fueled by Kremlin funding, most of the attacks came on foreign soil: Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. Congressional hearings on terrorism became as numerous as new Taylor Swift boyfriends are now. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the Czechs stopped coming, transnational terrorism threats quickly trended down. In the 90s, transnational terrorism made only occasional headlines. Among them were the first World Trade Center bombing, February 26, 1993, which killed 6, and Ahmed Resem, the inept Millennium bomber, arrested trying to enter the US on December 14, 1999. Rather than raise red flags, these attacks evoked images of the Keystone Cops. If that was the best the terrorists could muster, most Americans thought, then we had little to worry about. In 1999, Congress received the Hart-Rudman report declaring Americans will likely die on American soil, possibly in large numbers, from a terrorist attack. Few paid attention to the dire warning. The Commission's call for establishing a Department of Homeland Security was all but ignored. While America slept and the pace of terrorism waned, the plotting against us went largely unnoticed. Even the Hart-Rudman Commission largely missed the building threat. Hart-Rudman was concerned less about a global wave of transnational terrorism than the risk of a handful of terrorists obtaining chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons of mass destruction. Their model was not Al-Qaeda, but Aum Shinrikyo, a wacky Japanese death cult that released poison gas in a Tokyo subway in 1995. Yet the storm of transnational terrorism was gathering. At its center, arguably, was the shadowy Haqqani Network, a terrorist criminal extremist group in Pakistan. It was the Haqqanis who first organized efforts to bring in foreign fighters to help kick the Soviets out of Afghanistan. The Haqqanis backed the Taliban and convinced them to let Osama bin Laden set up training camps in Afghanistan. It was the Haqqanis who nourished the vision of transforming the Islamist agenda into a global insurgency. This is not to portray Osama bin Laden as simply a Haqqani puppet. He was not. Rather, he was a terrorist entrepreneur of extraordinary ambition. Bin Laden shared the old Soviet idea of using terrorism as a tool to undermine America's global influence. But he dared something that even the Kremlin left undreamed, taking the fight directly to America on a large scale. Bin Laden laid out his rationale for his new strategy in a fatwa and repeated it in public interviews, as he told ABC's John Miller in 1998. After God honored us with victory in Afghanistan, Muslim minds no longer believed in the myth of superpowers. The youth no longer saw America as a superpower. After leaving Afghanistan, they headed for Somalia and prepared for a long battle, thinking that the Americans were like the Russians. The youth were surprised at the low morale of the American soldiers and realized more than before that the American soldiers are paper tigers. After a few blows, the Americans ran away in defeat. After a few blows, they forgot about being the world leader and the leader of the New World Order. They left, dragging their corpses and their shameful defeat, and stopped using such titles. They learned in America that this name, God, is larger than them. Bin Laden reasoned that punishing attacks on the United States would eventually lead the US to withdraw from the world, leaving space for an Islamist movement to re-establish the historical caliphate. The rise of bin Laden and America's half-hearted effort to stop him in the 90s are well documented in the 9/11 Commission report. It makes for grim reading, like an inevitable unfolding of a Greek tragedy. The point is that if the Second World Trade Center bombing had failed, Al-Qaeda would have tried again and again until American streets ran red. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and their affiliates will continue their campaign until it's clear once and for all their narrative is false, that America will not falter, that the caliphate cannot stand. Now, let us shift towards some fine details. Nevertheless, not all take it this way and consider that in an alternate scenario where the September 11th attacks never occurred, the United States would have experienced a radically different trajectory in terms of social, security, and racism perceptions. Without this tragic event that marked the country's history, several aspects of American society would likely have evolved in distinct ways. Firstly, the absence of the September 11th attacks would have undoubtedly shaped domestic security policies in profound ways. Without the pressing need to combat international terrorism, government priorities may have shifted towards addressing other critical national security concerns. Resources that were previously directed towards counterterrorism efforts might have been reallocated to bolster cybersecurity measures, combat organized crime, or enhance disaster preparedness protocols. This potential redirection of resources could have led to a more diversified and comprehensive approach to safeguarding the nation against various threats, thereby strengthening overall domestic security infrastructure. In terms of foreign policy, the impact of the absence of the attacks would have been far-reaching. Successive American administrations would likely have crafted their strategies and engagements with the world differently. The absence of a catalyzing event like 9/11 might have prompted a re-evaluation of the United States' role and involvement in regions such as the Middle East. Without the imperative to respond to terrorist threats emanating from that region, there might have been a more tempered approach towards military interventions and diplomatic initiatives. This shift in approach could have potentially mitigated tensions and conflicts in certain parts of the globe, fostering a more stable international environment. On the economic front, the absence of the attacks could have reverberated throughout financial markets and the overall American economy. The reduction in expenditures related to national security and the fight against terrorism would have freed up considerable resources. These resources could have been redirected towards other areas of investment, stimulating economic growth and job creation. Moreover, the absence of the economic disruptions caused by the aftermath of 9/11, such as decreased consumer confidence and market volatility, might have contributed to a more stable and prosperous economic climate in the long term. Without the collective trauma inflicted by the terrorist attacks, it's conceivable that Americans would not have witnessed the surge in xenophobic sentiments and hate speech directed towards Muslims and individuals of Middle Eastern origin that allowed the events of September 11th. Furthermore, the absence of these attacks might have influenced immigration policies and attitudes towards immigrants in the United States. In the absence of the climate of fear and suspicion fueled by the aftermath of September 11th, the United States could have embraced more inclusive and open policies towards immigrants, fostering a culture of diversity and social integration. In the realm of culture, the absence of the attacks could have left a noticeable void in artistic production. Many films, books, and artworks have drawn inspiration from the events of September 11th and the subsequent war on terrorism. Without this pivotal moment in history, the American cultural landscape might have been characterized by narratives and artistic expressions exploring different themes and concerns. Turning to domestic politics, the absence of the attacks could have had ramifications for elections and political polarization in the United States. Presidents and members of Congress might have prioritized other domestic policy issues, such as healthcare, education, or the environment, over national security and counterterrorism concerns. In short, the absence of the September 11th attacks would have had a significant impact on many aspects of American society, ranging from foreign policy to culture to national security and social attitudes. While difficult to predict with certainty, it is clear that this event has left an indelible mark on the history of the United States and the world.